The rain had been coming down since sundown. The kind of slow, heavy drizzle that turns highway asphalt into a black mirror and makes every pair of headlights look like it's floating. Special Agent Renata Cole had been driving for just under 3 hours when she saw the blue and red lights bloom in her rearview mirror somewhere along the stretch of State Road 18 outside of Delwood. A mid-sized city in the middle of the country where she had spent the last 8 months doing something she could not yet tell anyone she was doing. She pulled over without hesitation. She knew exactly what to do. She had been trained for far worse than a traffic stop. She put both hands on the wheel, turned off the ignition, and waited. The officer took his time. That was the first tell. She had been watching men like him long enough to know that the delay was intentional, a little performance of power, making the person in the car sit with their own anxiety until he decided to move. She watched his silhouette in her side mirror. Broad shoulders, unhurried. He adjusted something in the front seat before he got out. She noted the time on her dashboard clock, 1:147 p.m. He came to her window with a flashlight that he shone directly into her eyes before he spoke. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation of why he'd pulled her over. Just a demand. And the light. Renata reached slowly into her glove box, retrieved the documents, and held them out the window. The officer's name badge read Stucky. She already knew that name. She had known it for 6 months. He took the documents without looking at her and walked back to his cruiser. She sat in the rain and waited. 8 minutes passed. When he came back, he didn't return her license right away. He stood at her window and looked into the back seat with the flashlight, letting the beam drag slowly across the upholstery, like he was searching for something he already expected to find. "Mum, do you know why I stopped you?" "No." "Sir, your left rear brake light is out." She had checked her brake lights 2 days ago, both working. She made a mental note of the time, 1:156 p.m. "I'll get that taken care of," she said. "Step out of the vehicle. Please." "Can I ask why?" "Because I'm asking you to." He pulled the door handle from outside before she could respond. "Step out." She got out slowly, keeping her hands visible. The rain soaked her blazer within seconds. She stood on the wet gravel shoulder and watched Stucky move toward her back passenger door. "I'm going to need your consent to search the vehicle." "I don't consent to a search." He smiled. It was a small smile, barely there. The kind a person makes when they've already decided how something is going to go. "I'm detecting an odor," he said. "That gives me probable cause." Renata said nothing. He opened the back door and spent approximately 90 seconds doing something she could not fully see from where she was standing. Then he stood up and turned around. In his gloved hand was a clear plastic sandwich bag containing a white powdery substance, roughly a quarter filled. "Well," he said, "look at that." She looked at it. She looked at his face. She had interviewed 41 people in the last 8 months. She had read hundreds of pages of incident reports, complaints, internal affairs filings, and surveillance log. She had sat in a parked sedan across from this man's patrol route on 11 separate evenings. And in all of that time, in all of those pages, she had never seen anyone describe the expression on his face, the way she was seeing it now, pleased. Not satisfied the way a cop feels when they've caught something real. Pleased the way a person feels when a plan is working. "That's not mine," she said. "They never are." He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Officer Stucky." Her voice was completely flat. He stopped. "You've just placed a foreign object into a vehicle that does not belong to the object's registered owner, on a road with no witnesses, at approximately midnight. After failing to state a legitimate reason for the initial stop, I want you to think very carefully about what you do in the next 30 seconds. He stared at her. The rain kept falling. "Turn around," he said again. But something in his voice had shifted by about half a degree. "My name is Renata Cole," she said. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Delwood Field Division. I have been conducting a formal investigation into your conduct for the past 8 months. I have a federal ID in my inside left jacket pocket. I am going to reach for it now. She reached in slowly and produced the credential wallet. She held it open in the rain in front of his flashlight. He read it. She watched his face do something complicated. He started. Don't, she said. Renata had grown up in a small city in Ohio, the second daughter of a postal worker and a high school librarian. She was not the kind of child who dreamed of law enforcement. She had wanted, at various points in her childhood, to be a marine biologist, an architect, and then, after reading a single book about Thurgood Marshall, at age 14, a civil rights attorney. She had gone to a state university on a partial academic scholarship, studied criminology and political science, and applied to the FBI on something that felt less like ambition and more like a very specific kind of anger that needed somewhere useful to go. She had been with the Bureau for 11 years. She had worked organized crime for 3 years in Philadelphia. She had spent 2 years on public corruption in the Southeast. She had done a year on a joint task force, looking at trafficking networks in the mid-Atlantic, before a reassignment brought her to the Delwood Division with a quiet, unsigned memo and a directive that was essentially 4 sentences long. There were problems in the Delwood Police Department's Patrol Division. The problems had been ongoing for at least 4 years. Complaints had been filed and disappeared. Someone needed to look at it from the outside. She was the outside. She had taken a furnished apartment on Creekside Drive under a cover identity, Renata Moore. Consultant. Recently relocated and spent the first 6 weeks doing nothing but reading. Complaint files. Internal affairs reports. Civil suit filings from people who had tried to sue the department and either settled quietly or had their cases thrown out on technicalities. She read arrest records and cross-referenced them with demographics and geography. She built a spreadsheet that she updated every single day. 4 names rose to the top. Stuckey was one of them. Officer Dale Stuckey had been with the Delwood PD for 9 years. He had 2 commendations for valor and 1 internal affairs inquiry that had been closed without findings after the complaining witness recanted. He had a mortgage in the Fairview Heights subdivision and a boat he kept at the marina on Kettle Lake. He coached youth wrestling at the YMCA on Burnham Road on Thursday evenings. He was, by every official measure, a fine officer and a community asset. The unofficial measure told a different story. In the past 4 years, Stuckey had made 47 arrests on drug-related charges along a specific corridor of the city, a stretch of road that ran through the Caldwell Park neighborhood, which was predominantly black and working class. 43 of those 47 arrests had resulted in charges being filed. Of those 43, 31 had pled out. Of the 12 that went to trial, 10 had been acquitted or had charges dismissed due to evidentiary problems. 2 had been convicted. When Renata mapped the arrest locations against the time of day, a pattern emerged that she documented carefully and said nothing about to anyone outside the Bureau. The arrests clustered between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. They were almost exclusively of individuals driving alone. 91% were black. The stated probable cause in every single report was either an equipment violation or a detected odor. She had also spoken, over the course of 8 months and under carefully managed circumstances, to 11 people who had been arrested by Stuckey and later had their charges dropped. She had met them in places that were not associated with law enforcement, a community center, a laundromat, the waiting room of a dental office. She had listened to them for as long as they were willing to talk. Most of them said roughly the same thing, in different words. With different amounts of anger or grief or resignation, he had put something in their car. They had said it wasn't theirs. They had not been believed. One woman, a home health aide named Darlene, who drove a 12-year-old Nissan, and worked the overnight shift at a care facility on the east side of the city, had been arrested, processed, and held for 60 hours before her public defender got the charges dropped on a chain of custody issue. She had lost her job. She was behind on her rent. She told Renata the story sitting in a plastic chair in a church meeting room on a Saturday morning, and she did not cry until she got to the part where her son, he was 9, had asked her if she was a criminal. Renata had driven home from that meeting and sat in her car in the parking lot of the apartment complex on Creekside Drive for a long time before going inside. The night of the stop, Renata had been returning from a meeting with her supervising agent at a location 40 miles outside of Delwood. The meeting had run long. There were developments in the broader investigation, things she could not discuss here, and she had taken State Road 18 back because it was direct and she was tired, and she had not anticipated anything happening because she was driving her own personal vehicle registered to her actual name, not her cover identity. And she had no drugs and no outstanding violations and no logical reason to be stopped. She had been wrong about the logical part. She understood, after the lights came on, that she had simply been visible. A black woman driving alone at night in a late-model sedan along a road Stuckey had apparently decided was his personal hunting ground. She had fit the profile he had built his entire career around. He hadn't known who she was. He had simply seen what he always saw, and done what he always did. What happened in the 45 minutes after Renata showed Stuckey her badge was something that would later be described in federal charging documents as a spontaneous and voluntary disclosure, although that phrase somewhat flattened the reality of the moment, which was that Stuckey, standing in the rain on the shoulder of State Road 18, holding a plastic bag of a substance that would later be identified as sodium bicarbonate mixed with a binding agent, not cocaine. Not anything controlled. But a prop began to talk. He started with denial. Brief. It didn't hold. Then he tried to explain the bag had been in the car already. He'd found it. He was following procedure. Renata listened with her hands in her jacket pockets, and her expression unchanged. She had learned a long time ago that silence was a better interrogation tool than most people gave it credit for. He moved from explanation to something approaching negotiation. He knew things. He could tell her things. There were other officers. He wasn't the only one. She told him she would need him to say all of this again, in a recorded setting, with counsel present, if he chose, and that she was not in a position to make any promises on behalf of the United States government tonight or any other night, but that what he chose to do in the next several minutes was entirely up to him. He called a lawyer at 1223 A.M. Renata sat in her car and called her supervising agent. She described what had happened in precise, chronological terms. She noted what she had observed, what she had been told, and what the plastic bag had contained. She did not speculate, and she did not editorialize. She drove home, changed into dry clothes, and wrote up the incident report from memory in under 40 minutes. It was one of the cleaner reports she had ever filed. The arrest of Dale Stuckey happened 17 days later, on a morning when the weather had turned cold and the leaves on the trees along the Caldwell Park corridor had gone fully yellow. He was taken into custody outside the wrestling gym at the YMCA on Burnham Road. M. by 2 agents from the Delwood Field Division, who were not Renata. She was not present for the arrest. She had specifically requested not to be. The charges were substantial civil rights violations under federal statute, evidence tampering, official misconduct, and conspiracy, because Stuckey had been right that he wasn't the only one. 2 other officers were named as co-conspirators in the initial indictment. A 4th was named in a superseding indictment, filed 3 weeks later. The Delwood Police Department statement said that the department took all allegations of misconduct seriously and was cooperating fully with the federal investigation. The chief of police, who had been in office for 6 years, announced his intention to retire at the end of the month. The local paper ran the story on the front page 2 days in a row. On the 3rd day, A television news crew from the regional station parked outside the courthouse and did a segment that mentioned, briefly, that the investigation had been initiated by a federal agent who had herself been targeted by one of the officers under investigation during the course of the investigation. They did not name Renata. She had asked them not to. What the television segment did not cover, because Renata did not discuss it publicly, and the charging documents described it only in the language of statutes and probable cause, was what it had felt like to stand on that wet gravel shoulder at midnight with her hands visible and her badge in the rain. She had been angry. She was clear-eyed about that. Not in the way that interferes with professional function. She had the training to separate the feeling from the conduct, and she had done so cleanly, but the anger had been real, and it had been specific. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed she was carrying something she wasn't. It wasn't the first time she had watched someone decide what she was before she'd had a chance to say a word. But there was something about being in the middle of an 8-month investigation into exactly this behavior, and then having it happen to her, that felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation of something she had already known but had been too professional to say out loud. She said it to her therapist. 6 weeks later, she said it didn't surprise me. And then the fact that it didn't surprise me is what I keep coming back to. Her therapist, who was a practical woman, said, "What are you going to do with that?" Renata thought about Darlene and the plastic chair in the church meeting room. She thought about the 11 people she had spoken to in laundromats and waiting rooms. She thought about the 31 people who had pled out on charges that were almost certainly manufactured. She thought about the ones she didn't know about yet. The ones who hadn't filed complaints or hadn't talked to anyone. The ones who had simply absorbed the damage and kept moving, because what else do you do? She said, "I'm going to finish the work." The trial of Dale Stuckey began on a Tuesday in late winter. In a federal courtroom on the 6th floor of the building on Garrison Street, Renata testified on the second day of proceedings. In a dark navy suit she had bought specifically for the occasion, and shoes that were practical and well worn. She sat in the witness box and answered questions in the same flat, precise, chronological manner she used for everything. And she did not look at Stuckey's face while she was speaking. Not because she was afraid to, but because it wasn't relevant. What was relevant was the timeline, the evidence log, the recording from Stuckey's own patrol car dash camera, which had, against all odds, captured the sequence of events on State Road. 18 inches. Adequate enough detail. To confirm the sequence she described, the defense made 3 arguments over the course of the trial. The first was that the substance in the bag had been in the vehicle before Stuckey opened the door, that he had found it rather than placed it. The second was that Renata had a professional incentive to characterize the encounter in the worst possible light, because a documented misconduct event occurring during her investigation would strengthen the case she had built. The third was that the totality of the evidence against Stuckey was circumstantial and relied too heavily on a pattern analysis that was, ultimately, a matter of interpretation. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. The foreperson read the verdict on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on 4 of 5 counts. The 5th count, conspiracy, was hung. But a second superseding indictment on that charge was filed the following month, with additional evidence recovered during the continued investigation. Stuckey was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. One of his co-conspirators accepted a plea agreement. The other 2 went to trial separately. Both were convicted. In the months that followed the sentencing, Renata returned to her desk at the Delwood Field Division and picked up the next case. There was always a next case. She did not give interviews. She did not attend the press conference the U.S. Attorney's office held on the steps of the federal building. She was mentioned in the official statement as the investigating agent, without further specification, and she thought that was exactly right. What she did do, approximately 3 weeks after the sentencing, was make a phone call. She had gotten the number through a colleague. She sat at her desk at 4:45 inches the afternoon and dialed, and when the woman on the other end picked up, Renata said, This is Agent Cole. I don't know if you remember me. We met at a church on a Saturday morning about 9 months ago. You told me about a traffic stop. There was a pause on the other end. I remember. Darlene said, I wanted you to know that the officer who stopped you has been convicted on federal charges. He's going to prison. Another pause. Longer this time. Is this real? Darlene asked. It's real. She heard something on the other end of the line that might have been breathing. Or might have been something else. I got a new job. Darlene said after a moment. It took a while. But I got one. I'm glad. Renata said. They were quiet together for a few seconds. Then Darlene said, did he do it to somebody else, before they caught him? Renata thought about what she was permitted to say and what she wasn't. And then she thought about Darlene sitting in a plastic chair in a church room on a Saturday morning, talking about her 9-year-old son. Yes. She said, he did it to a lot of people. They're part of the record now. Every one of them. Darlene didn't say anything for a long moment. Thank you. She finally said, Renata said, thank you for telling me. She hung up the phone. She looked at the case file open on her desk. She picked up her pen and got back to work. The complaint database for the Delwood Police Department was, by the time the investigation concluded, publicly accessible for the first time in the department's history, a condition of the consent agreement the city had signed with the Justice Department as part of the broader resolution of the federal findings. It listed names, dates, location, and outcomes. It was not everything. It was nowhere near everything. But it was there. And it was searchable. And it was a beginning. Renata drove out of Delwood on a Thursday morning in early spring. Her personal car loaded with 2 duffel bags and a box of files she would transfer to the field office in her next assignment city. The weather was clear. The road ahead was long and flat, and the sky was the kind of pale blue that only appears in early spring, when the light is new again after a long winter. She had been asked, in her exit interview with the division supervisor, whether there was anything about the Delwood case she wanted to formally note before she transferred. A question about process. En administrative question, she had said yes. Document the stop on State Road 18 inches full. Include my name. Include the time. Include the fact that the agent conducting the investigation was targeted by the subject of that investigation during the investigation. The supervisor had asked why she wanted it documented that way. Because it happened, she had said, and everything that happens should be on the record. She drove north on the highway, with both hands on the wheel, and the windows cracked open just enough to let the spring air in. The road stretched ahead of her, clean and bright. And she kept going.